everything is combined, right? But you need high reliability to drive utilization, but you need utilization to drive reliability. And you need all of that to work to drive network expansion.
Welcome back to another episode of In Between Charges, the perfect podcast to listen to while waiting for your EV to charge. I am Kevin Spangenberg and am joined, as always, by Mike Hawks. Mike, how are we doing today?
Very good, thank you. Very good. Excited for the Easter weekend. And I guess also we're getting ready for the inevitable holiday roaming surge across Denmark and then also some other markets. So kind of hot off making sure that everyone gets their charging as they need to.
Yeah, we have a number of our partners that have some roaming-specific requests in the coming months to make sure they're ready for the rush coming up here. Mike, you read the news a little bit. What's in the news quite a bit right now?
It begins with T, and it definitely ends in the plural.
No, we're not talking about tariffs.
Okay, right.
All right. But America is in the news quite a bit, and today we are going to talk about America. We're not talking about tariffs. We have the pleasure of speaking with a leading voice in the American EV charging scene. Chris Kaiser has most recently been at Sona Energy Solutions, but is now forging his own path as a ChargePoint operator called PlugIn. And we are excited that Chris will be building out his new business on top of the Monta platform. Chris also has a newsletter with thousands of subscribers where he covers trends, strategies, and the basics of EV charging for an American and global audience. So I have a feeling we can cover quite a few elements of the American EV charging scene in some detail today. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Chris, maybe just a quick introduction here. How did you end up in the EV charging space yourself, and what brought you to speak with us today?
Yeah, great question. Previously to EV charging, I was doing LED lighting retrofits. So I was doing that basically from 2011. But I've been interested in clean energy and sustainability even before I graduated. So I was a mechanical engineer from Georgia Tech. I took a class on the ethics of business sustainability in 2004 while I was studying abroad with the Georgia Tech Oxford program. So in that program, you travel around Europe for about a month, and then you're in Oxford, England for a month. And it was great. It was probably the best summer of my life. But I was introduced to the concept of sustainability, and I realized that I really liked that. I wanted to help companies become more sustainable, save energy, reduce packaging, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted to be more out and about, meeting people and seeing things. And so I went into sales. And after doing industrial automation sales for a couple of years, in 2011, I started working directly in clean energy and lighting retrofit projects. Did that until 2019, had my own company for about a year until COVID hit. And EV charging around then was, starting to become a bigger and bigger thing. I realized that I'm not doing any lighting retrofits, so I might as well get into EV charging. So I did that around August of 2020 when I really first started. And me and a friend started a company. We were going to do something around the service of EV charging stations, so doing site surveys for other companies or helping with project management and rollouts. And that never really took off. But in the spring of 2021, I joined Sona Energy full-time. And I told the founders, Dan and Dave, that I wanted to do EV charging. And they were fully supportive, and they just said, yeah, let's do it. And so the same leadership team behind Sona Energy is also behind PlugIn, two separate entities. I lead PlugIn. I'm still involved with Sona, still help out on lighting retrofit projects. And it turns out it's a really good source for some of our customers for EV charging. So we work with a grocery store or a hotel or commercial property, helping them on energy efficiency. And then we say, hey, have you thought about EV charging? And that becomes an opportunity for the EV charging side of the business. So we've been working on the plug-in concept for a couple of years now, because when we first started in the spring of 2021, we knew that multifamily properties were then, and they still are, one of the best applications for level 2 EV charging. So in 2021, we went to the National Apartment Association convention in Chicago, just because, we had to start somewhere. And that was our first instance of just getting out in the marketplace and learning and speaking with property owners about how they view EV charging. And then it just really progressed from there.
Hearing that story kind of brings to mind a number of different companies and people that we interact with. But in Europe, I think it's a little bit more kind of become professionalized a bit, right? Whereas in the US, it's just at the EV charging summit, we ran into each other there. And you see a lot of people with these backgrounds from maybe lighting, right? Maybe signage or, some other kind of engineering type of background.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to see the route that a lot of the individuals such as yourself and companies as well that are getting into this. And still, there's a lot to shake out, right? Till you see, all right, who's actually going to kind of be the winner in 5-10 years.
Maybe coincidence or maybe not, but I think around August of 2020 is when Casper and Anders were starting their first kind of rounds of development in Monta, and we got set up.
Oh, interesting.
And it wasn't until kind of February of 2021. So fate would have it, we were all getting started at around the same time.
So now you've been heavily involved then for the last 4 or 5 years, Chris. Monta, like Mike just mentioned, we were started 4 years ago over here in Denmark, now fairly decent presence throughout the European continent. Relatively new in the US scene. We launched there last summer. That's been my primary project, and that's how we became introduced. Maybe help our audience a little bit. How has the market kind of developed in your eyes? I keep reading stories of quality is not improving, right? Do we still hear real challenges around availability and everything in the market? 20% failure rates. Why is this not getting, steadily better? Why is it stubbornly kind of still a difficult scene and there's not real markers of quality and success in the American EV charging market?
I'll do my best to answer it. First, I would challenge a little bit that quality is not improving, because I do think it is improving, and it is hard to find a direct metric that measures quality over time, because there is no clear accepted metric that everyone in the industry uses. So one of my favorite ones that is gaining more traction, and I write about, and I can't even remember the acronym off my head, but it's basically the first charge success rate. So not was someone able to charge at an EV charging station while they were there? It might have taken them 4 attempts, but if they were still able to charge, then many networks would say, hey, that's 100% success rate. They were able to charge. They got what they wanted. But I think a better metric is the first charge success attempt rate. And that's starting to gain traction, and I think that's improving. Casper actually does a phenomenal job of posting on LinkedIn, making it publicly available, the different hardware on the Monta network and what the success rates there of that hardware. And I think over time, it is improving. I think a couple of years ago, I remember, I think it was Christmas season of 2021 or 2022. And I just remember following folks like Kyle Connor and Brendan Flash, and they were going on these EV road trips just to experience the Electrify Americas and EV Goes of the world. And it was just like failure after failure all around. And I just feel qualitatively that those experiences are getting better and better. And I do monitor the PlugShare scores around the stations that we have. And it does seem like, the Electrify Americas and EV Goes of the world are getting better and better, and they're replacing equipment. So one, I would say that I do think quality is improving. To your point about why has it persisted for so long, or why is it still not great? Because it might be improving, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. But it's something that we focus on at PlugIn, because, we're a small company. I'm in the middle of trying to brainstorm the best ways to raise money in 2025 in this environment. We kind of started with Trump tariffs and all that. But the only way that we feel that we can compete and we can go to these big corporations and big businesses that everyone has heard of, and we can be credible in front of them, is that we have a laser focus on EV driver experience. And as a small company, we can't be competitive if we're not better than the existing networks. I don't want to be as good. We need to be better than them from a quality perspective. And so we operate 3 fast charging stations around the country right now, but all of them have a 10 PlugShare score. So in the US, PlugShare is the best tool, I think, that EV drivers can look for EV chargers around them. And if they're planning a road trip, it doesn't really help you if you just know that there's a charging station there. You need to know it's there, and you need to know there's a high probability that if you stop there, you're going to be able to get a successful charge. I don't know what goes into that score, but it's the best metric I found to gauge reliability. But the simple answer is, why has quality persisted is my perception over the past decade in EV charging is the companies that have existed haven't been laser focused on EV driver experience. They've been laser focused on network expansion. So that's a drastically different focus.
Yeah.
Because it's not a zero-sum game, but it kind of is, because if you're putting all your investment dollars into network expansion, the network expansion is what you're going to communicate to your investors and communicate internally as your goals.
We took a look at, I think it was 17,000 or so of the first-time users, looking at essentially how much they would come back and run repeat charges within the first 3 months. And you see a huge drop-off rate. If that first successful charge of that first-time user isn't successful, and it means that they have to drive to a different charge point, the amount that they would charge in the next 3 months, it dropped by almost 60%. And it's really interesting to see. But what people are really looking for is the strong charging experience. And that's what businesses need to focus on to be able to kind of differentiate. If you can say that you're increasing the success rate by 1%, 2%, 3% across your whole network, that's a huge return on how much electricity you'll actually be kind of transacting.
There's one other piece, and Kevin, I think we'll get into this later, but what makes all of this very difficult is, there's this huge chicken and egg problem that we've had in the industry and we still have. But let's say 10 years ago, you're going to try to create a CPO and you put stations in the ground. And let's say utilization back then was a fifth of what it is today. Well, if it didn't ramp up as fast as you thought it would, and your financial pro formas aren't performing like you thought they were, you don't have as much money for future expansion. You don't have as much money to do proactive maintenance on stations or to hire someone to monitor and handle customer service. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, you're going out to investors and saying, hey, give us more money for expansion. They say, well, wait a minute, we gave you money 2 years ago and you told us the stations were going to perform like this. How are those stations performing? And then they may say, well, our revenue's it's 50% of what we predicted it would be. And they're like, well, wait a minute, we're not going to give you any more money if the stations that you told us were going in are not performing. Everything is combined, right? But, you need high reliability to drive utilization, but you need utilization to drive reliability. And you need all of that to work to drive network expansion.
Yeah.
And, every year, every 6 months, there's some other piece of news that comes out. I don't even know how long ago it was, a year and a half ago, when Ford announced they were transitioning from CCS to NACS in the United States. Whereas in Europe, I think the Teslas have the CCS. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
But just that one little feature drastically changes everything we're talking about, right? So let's say prior to Ford announcing they were going to NACS, you were a network and you were installing dual port stations that had a CCS port and a CHAdeMO port.
Yep.
Well, then when that announcement comes off, you're like, stop the presses. Like we need to rethink our entire approach. And so you keep having these curveballs thrown at you as a ChargePoint operator where you're trying to predict where the market's going, but the direction keeps changing. And all of these issues that have impacted reliability and profitability. And if CPOs aren't profitable, it's hard to focus on reliability.
On that kind of Tesla point, and furthermore, the other big player in the American scene is obviously ChargePoint. So Europe has I don't want to say luxury, but maybe the benefit of developing with a single charging standard, not as dominant of a player as ChargePoint or Tesla. Tesla's big over here, but they're by no means the biggest, right? So there's a lot more money, energy flowing to different players. Then in the US, you have obviously Tesla, which has dominated the DC fast charging scene. And then you have ChargePoint that's dominated the level 2 scene for the most part. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the ChargePoint model a little bit, how their approach to distribution has kind of impacted the market and maybe led to that deterioration of quality, where they put a lot of onus on the site host, basically, to kind of manage their charger, right? And there wasn't necessarily an owner-operator that would take responsibility for it. So you were relying on the service and the success team of ChargePoint or of EV Connect to handle this. And these would be maybe uneducated site hosts in an EV sense, right? And there's kind of this gap in accountability, right? So now you're going to become an owner and operator, and you're going to be accountable for the plug-in sites. But up until this point, there's a lot of charge points or other brands of chargers around the country that are kind of sitting there and no one's maintaining them and no one's accountable for them.
And that's a great lead in because, that issue is really what we formed PlugIn to solve, right? So at PlugIn, we don't want to just sell hardware and software combos to a dual port charger that's going to sit in the back of a grocery store parking lot. Like that is not what we're interested in. We want to find locations where you need a lot of chargers and they're going to get used a lot. And then we will either own and operate those chargers, or we will sell those chargers and then we will take a smaller percentage to operate them. So it's own and or operate.
Yep.
But the key there is we want to be involved in the ongoing operation. Is one, because it's recurring revenue, and recurring revenue is great for a business. But two is we really believe that if no one is actively managing and involved in maintaining that station, it's just something's going to happen and something's going to break and no one's going to fix it and it's going to frustrate EV drivers. So to the ChargePoint question, and at one point in time, they could have been considered a leader in fast charging, but I think the data is indicating that that's no longer the case. There may be some rare instances, but for the most part, I would say 95% of the chargers they put out in the wild, they are selling to other businesses to operate. I think that the messaging or the sales approach from ChargePoint was like, hey, put these in your parking lot and it's going to be great. It's going to be a revenue generator, whether it brings in X amount of business to your business or the charging station itself is going to pay for itself and then start spinning out profit. And that was the sales and marketing message. And the reality is, especially let's say from 2010 to 2020, or even 2010 to really now, is that just wasn't the case in the majority of the United States. So I think later I'd like to just speak about geography and population density and how that impacts the United States versus Europe. But in the United States, you have California, and then you have everyone else. In California, the EV adoption rate or the number of EVs, it's literally like 10x the nearest competitor. So in California, that message that ChargePoint was putting out may have been accurate, right? In the other, 49 states, you spend $30,000 to put that dual port charger in, and I'm very skeptical you're ever seeing a return on that investment because you're gonna have to replace the charger in 10 years before you've recouped your initial investment. And so that's just been the reality of those level 2, not all of them, but I would, and I don't have the data, ChargePoint has the data, but I would be astonished if that ROI was below 5 years for, call 50% of the stations that have been out there. And I think it's just that issue of the initial early adopters thought it would be a lot easier to operate those stations, but it is just challenging, all because of that kind of chicken and egg. Is you put them in, and I think people expect the utilization to be a lot higher than just the reality is. And that, goes into population density and all those fun discussions, but also ChargePoint's incentivized, and it's not just them, right? We're just kind of using them as a proxy because they are the biggest.
Yep.
But if you're a hardware software manufacturer, which is different from a CPO, right? A CPO buys stations and wants to operate them profitably.
Yep.
Hardware software manufacturer just wants to get stuff out there. If you're a hardware software manufacturer, you just want to get stations out in the wild. You don't care where they are going because a sale is a sale. And so I think this just goes into all of the issues that we see is because people are not focused on reliability of the charging stations. They're focused on other stuff. And, that might be because they have other jobs and they were just tasked with it, or they were just trying to sell the hardware software and they didn't care.
Yeah, because I think it's a really nice practical description of just a real kind of core challenge with this, which is often it's individual sites, projects, etc., that just they want to have a charge point there. It might not even be a revenue generator. It's just a necessity. It's something that's like auxiliary to a business, providing a kind of EV to its employee. And I think it's also kind of the starting nature of the industry. It's been so fragmented in US and also in Europe. And this gap that you're kind of alluding to, this gap of, I don't want to operate this. Is this something that's actually my core business? No. Is this central to my core revenue? No. Okay, well, it's something that I can just put in the ground and then the drivers will come and that's it. It feels like over time, that problem has become much more understood. That to be able to actually make this service reliable and continuous, you need to invest time, skills, experience, engineers, the right cabling, the right theft protection as well. But the reality is, it's a very hard business to actually really make work and make ends meet unless it is your core business, unless it's something that you're really focused on and you have a strategy that you can actually really deliver on. And, maybe now in the US, it's just starting to turn that corner a little bit where that middle gap of operations is now being filled. It maybe then kind of leads on to a next question when we're talking about where ChargePoint started off and maybe where some of the companies that you're working with, the phrase comes to mind, staying in your lane. And maybe, in Europe, just to kind of contrast it, one of the things that is regulated, mandated is interoperability between different players. And perhaps that encourages a degree of specialization, which hasn't yet really organically grown in US to the same extent. Businesses are incentivized to try to take as big a share of the pie as possible and vertically integrate and then be able to really provide end-to-end service whilst perhaps making that choice and realizing they've bitten off a little bit more than they can actually chew. For us, right, we do software, we know software very well. That's our core focus. And then we partner and integrate with hardware manufacturers and try to basically bring that out into the market. But could you maybe kind of share your point of view about how PlugIn is trying to solve that type of challenge by your approach to different partners and who you work with within the industry?
Yeah, great question. So where do I start? So our first fast charger project we got involved with actually was a contact who was at a grocery store that Sona was doing lighting retrofits at. He left the grocery store, became the global energy manager of Wendy's corporate. And so we started speaking with him and we looked at different options, but they said, hey, we want to make Frosties and burgers and fries and, crispy chicken sandwiches, which I love. We don't want to operate EV charging stations. And so kind of by default, that's how we became a ChargePoint operator. So we said, all right, well, let's look at the corporate Wendy's locations and let's see where there are incentives. Because in the US, I'm guessing it's similar in Europe, is that there are utility incentives or state grants. There were federal incentives, and those are kind of in limbo right now. At that time, this was around 2022, Colorado had some really good incentives. Their energy office is great to work with. And I think the grants that we've received to date are part of the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal. So states could choose how they use that money. And I think states like Colorado decided to use that money to fund EV charging infrastructure. So we actually had a grant from the state. So our first project, we became a ChargePoint operator to solve the problem of Wendy's loving the idea of EV chargers at their locations, but wanting someone else to kind of operate the chargers. That's where we said, hey, we really need to have a hardware manufacturer that's a separate entity from the charge management software. And I think, obviously we're talking, so I think that was a good decision. That was not Monta. That was, at this point, we've tried 3 different charge management softwares on a couple different hardware platforms. They're all working great, but none of them really provided, I would say, the level of either service or detail that I really wanted to use to help PlugIn grow. And so the second half of last year, I really spent the bulk of my time researching our different options for a white label CMS provider, or one that we could white label now or in the future. As we grow, we do want to promote the PlugIn brand a little bit more. And luckily, or I think maybe surprisingly, I feel like we're almost in this golden age of CMS providers that are willing to work with companies like us. Whereas a couple of years ago, I just don't think that was the case. And then there were a bunch of other startups getting off the ground. Where in Europe, I think is a couple of years ahead of just EV adoption and then where the market is and just a couple of years ahead of maturity. And so that's just obviously like Monta came over to the United States around the same time we were getting serious about building our own brand. So the timing worked out, but I think it's really important for new ChargePoint operators to consider their platform. And if you use a platform that is a hardware, software that's the same company, you're putting all your eggs in that basket. Whereas, using a separate CMS provider from the hardware gives you more flexibility. And I obviously am biased, but I think it's a better platform. I think the fact that Monta had made the investment into the United States and CEO Casper moved over here to get that office off the ground spoke volumes to me in that, is serious about the market. As we saw, and as we'll continue to see, there's a lot of big names in the EV charging industry who are either going to go out of business or they're going to pull out of the U.S. market. And so I think that kind of reinforced that you need to have strong partners that you believe are going to be in the U.S. market for the long haul. Yeah. And I got that feeling with Monta, and so that's kind of how we ended up here.
Yeah. You popped down to the Miami office a few weeks ago to meet Casper and everything. I was bummed I wasn't there for that. But the U.S.'s Strategic Initiative 1 or 1A here at Monta internally. Like you've mentioned, we're a couple of years ahead over here in Europe. There's a lot of problems that we believe we've had to solve for already that maybe American operators have not encountered yet. So hopefully we can bring these solutions to people such as yourselves that can kind of take these solutions that are already built and scale up quickly, right? And get to a professionalism and an experience level that is really needed in the market, right? So that's kind of our mission.
I want to stress that the longer I spoke with these companies, I realized picking a provider from Europe gives you a leg up because the European providers have, to your point, seen a lot of these issues already. Whereas, say, the American or North American CMS providers, they know like it's on their roadmap to have these features, but they don't see the demand in the US market. In Europe, you have to have those features. I just felt that for all else considered, the same price, everything else, you're just going to get a more feature-rich solution. And so just because you see OCPP, to me, in 2025, in the year 2025, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just like table stakes. Like you need to have a cable on a charging station for it to work. You need to have OCPP to make it work. Yeah. But just because you have a cable on a charging station doesn't mean it's a good charging station. Just because you have OCPP on a charging station doesn't mean it's good. So the quality of the vendor is the most important out of everything.
And that can be a hard thing for people in your position to judge, right? Because I'm sure everybody's promising you the world and you're operating with imperfect information, right? And you're seeing a lot of the same things on a website, the same things on a slide and everything. And then you need to actually get in and use it and ask these questions and stress test it. Frankly, I think the US competitive landscape that we've observed, and there's some software platforms over there and everything, but I think some of the immaturity of the lack of features of some of these platforms is just representative of, okay, it's a little bit more immature market, so they haven't had to solve XYZ problem just yet. And also that kind of ChargePoint model a little bit seeped out into other companies that are trying to do everything, right? And you just can't really do that. There's very few that have done it well, and ChargePoint is maybe the one that's done it the best, and even they are struggling, right? And I think there's a real lane for companies such as yourself to piece it together in a smart way and to get the right software and get the right hardware and get the right project management and understanding of where the opportunities are and the right sales motion and everything, and maybe put together a more price competitive offering. They're not cheap, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, you can say the ChargePoint, and it's like, oh, maybe they're doing okay. It's like over $400 a year per port or something like that for the connectivity fee. And so that's a real lane, I think, that's open for like, okay, there is better software than what ChargePoint has. There is better hardware than what ChargePoint has. And there could be a better overall operator that can put this all together and be accountable for that operation.
You know, there's kind of 2 points that we've kind of touched on is just staying in your lane. And there are a couple of entities that are startup CMSs, but they also kind of had similar origin stories maybe to ours, but they aren't pure CMSs. They want to also sell the hardware. They want to sell a complete package. And I get it because like if you're selling a 150 kW fast charging station, and we're going to do that too, right? Like we want to sell the hardware software bundle, but that's our business because then we want to operate it. But then there's others who also want to do that. And then they want to go out and they want to sell their software to other people. So they're kind of competing with me on the plugin side, but they also say, oh, hey, let us also sell you the software. I'm like, well, why would I do that? Because you might end up competing with me on a project. And I don't know what your real focus is. And I don't know who you really view as the customer. Is the CPO the customer or is the end user the customer? I have a chat group on LinkedIn just with some other EV professionals in the United States. And we were actually talking about leads given from a vendor that we've all mentioned. And they were just complaining about the quality of the leads. And I sent a meme from Glenn Ross. But it's like, well, is the vendor keeping the really good leads and then they're just giving the bottom of the barrel leads to other people around the country? And that's what I don't want, right? I want to find a partner who says, hey, you know, Chris and PlugIn, you are a customer. If we have an end user that comes through, we're not going to try to sell them directly with our solution. We're going to work with you to try to get that deployed. Yeah. And so that's why I think it's very valuable for folks in my shoes to find a software vendor who only wants to sell software and you're very clear on what the approach is. The other topic about why I think that these other companies are trying different stuff is it's just that chicken and egg. It's really challenging to make money. Let's say selling software. If you're trying to sell a level 2, and let's say it's $200 a year per port. And I don't know what let's say the margin again is 50% for easy number. So you make $100 a year per port, but you know, programmers aren't cheap. Employees aren't cheap. So you need to sell a lot of ports to recoup that investment. And it's just really challenging. And so another way is like, hey, let me go sell a 150 kW charging station and maybe my gross profit on that's going to be $10,000. And so it's like I can sell 100 software licenses at $100, or I can sell one charging station. And while the 100 software licenses are recurring revenues, that's good. But it's like, if you're burning through cash, you need money coming in the door now. So I think that chicken and egg nature is why some of these other companies have had to do these different business models. And I know because luckily we've had the Sona business to kind of help fund this EV charging effort that we're now spinning out. But it's really challenging to make money in EV charging for all these reasons. And I've kind of spoken about population density. And my perspective as an American who has worked either around or in or with European companies is the European leaders think that the U.S. market just needs to do things like they do it in Europe and it'll be successful. And they don't want to spend time understanding like, well, maybe the U.S. market is different for a reason. And I think a big reason is just geography and just the scale of the United States versus Europe and Western Europe, right? Just west of the Czech Republic and just call that Western Europe. That basically fits east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States. Or I did some look into Denmark, where Monta is based, but if you look at Georgia, it's roughly 3.5 times the square miles of Denmark. But Denmark, I think, has like 300,000 registered EVs. Georgia has 100,000 registered EVs. And so if you do a EV per square mile, it's 10x in Denmark versus Georgia. And so there's just that population density, but it goes a little deeper than that, because I think the connotation when I say population density, I think people might picture a circle and you picture dots kind of equally spread out on that circle. But in EVs, it's not just that. It's what is the longest distance between two fast chargers on a road trip that I need to use? And a good example is in Georgia, but from my house just north of Atlanta to Savannah, it's about a 3.5 hour drive. And I've done that drive in an EV several times. And the first one was in an Audi e-tron. And we had just gotten the e-tron. The e-tron's an amazing car. We've had it now for a little over 4 years. But at the time I did this drive, we'd had it for a month. We had a 2.5-year-old and a 6-week-old, and we were going to Hilton Head, just a little bit north of Savannah in South Carolina. We were going to the beach with friends. And my wife was like, hey, you've gotten this plotted out, right? And I'm like, yeah, don't worry, I have it plotted out. There's a charging station at a Burger King between Macon and Savannah. And long story short, we got there and the charger was broken. It was just one. It was actually a Tritium that ChargePoint was the software on, and Georgia Power was the utility actually owned at the station. So you kind of had these different entities who were operating the station, but it wasn't working. And the one 50 miles down the road wasn't working. So we actually had to backtrack 50 miles the other way to hit a fast charger because it had 52 miles of range, charge for an hour and a half because it was a 62.5, or no, these were 50 kW stations. So then we can make it to the other charging station in Savannah. That was in the fall of 2020. And today, in the spring of 2025, it's the same exact situation on that stretch of road. So Circle K has a fast charger station that came online around this year. And then closer to Savannah, there's a fast charger station. And those two stations, they've been upgraded, but you have 160 miles with just 2 ports in total for non-Tesla vehicles. So again, I say this because I have personal experience with this station or with this stretch. Like, this is a very popular stretch of highway between Atlanta and Savannah. And it's just this concept that it's not just population density, it's just charger density between two thoroughly traveled cities. And so when you have a higher number of EVs per given landmass, you're going to have a higher probability of having numerous EV charging stations to charge at. And so I think it's that chicken and egg, again, due to the just geography and the scale in the United States, that has prevented the market from taking off like it has in Europe. So I think Europeans think it's just that the Americans are just like, brutes. And, 2025, I don't know if I blame them for that perception, but there's always more to the story. And I think we don't think that's just geography. Yeah. Maybe geography and landmass play a lot into that. Right. And it's just like, so in Europe, yes, they are more progressive thinking, but it's also that gasoline in Europe costs a lot more than it does in the United States.
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
So that drives people EV adoption. And so there's all these other issues that play into it that just makes it more complicated. And it's just not as simple as, oh, they're just not as progressive or whatever.
I was trying to think about this before we had this discussion, Chris, and like, what are some of the real key kind of divergent directions that US and Europe have gone down that, creates a very different market condition? And one of the ones that we talked a lot about before already is, policy. In Europe, we have the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation. Across the US, it's very much state-based, and there's different varieties of what that would mean, right? Dictating how a charge point should be set up, et cetera. And then it is really geography and personal driving behaviors, basically, as you started to say. The average distance that a driver will drive on a daily or a weekly basis is a fifth of what people will be doing in the US. And so as a result, the needs for public charging are very, very different. And you need to be able to make sure that there's not these charging, deserts basically in between two different sites as the one you use. It's a challenge. You've got nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
And I guess then, the other thing is just general kind of accessibility and like density of residences, private homes versus multifamily homes, and then as a result, how much of a reliance there is on the public charging network. And I think that also seems to be a big difference. And it's why perhaps DC charging is taking up a bigger ratio in the US, or maybe playing a bigger, earlier role than it would have done, or is kind of in Europe, where we're seeing much more growth in level 2.
One other point I failed to mention is, so that stretch I'm speaking about, I-16 between Atlanta and Savannah.
You can picture it in your mind, can't you, Chris? I can see you driving down the road and feeling the frustration as you're.
Yeah, I'll really get off on a rant if I keep thinking about it too much. But I solved my problems because we were just in Savannah in Thanksgiving last year. I bought a Tesla, or I leased a Tesla Y that I got in February of 2024. And so that stretch in a Tesla is super easy because the supercharger team has done an amazing job of deploying chargers on that route. So there's probably, 20 Tesla ports compared to 2 CCS ports on that stretch. But it's not like things are bleak everywhere in the United States. It's just if you have a Tesla in the United States, you're pretty much covered for the majority of routes that people use.
Yeah.
If you have a Tesla, and it's getting better if you have a non-Tesla vehicle. But it is just the scale of things makes it harder to put in stations, to get those stations to be used, but also just the service and just the cost to go do site visits. So just by having more stations in a tight geographic area, you can have a higher profitability of those stations. So I'll kind of end my rant there, but I think just the geography and population centers in the United States make it very challenging to be a profitable CPO.
I wonder how many people listening into this are also smiling or kind of grinning ear to ear, having driven the same stretch of road and can really empathize with you. I'm sure that you are not the only one who's found this a particularly difficult challenge.
Yeah, no, it's fairly well known in the Southeast, and I'm sure there's other stretches like that across the country.
All right, Chris, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss a little bit of the political or policy climate, I guess, in the United States. I'm not going to turn this into some political talk show and everything, but I just kind of want to get your take a little bit on the current administration's policy so far as it relates to electric vehicle tax credits. I don't believe they're gone yet by the time this is out. They very well could be, the $7,500 tax credit, as well as NEVI funding, which has largely been frozen, if I understand correctly. I don't believe you're too involved in the NEVI process, but I'm sure you understand it pretty well. Q1 seemed like it was pretty strong sales growth, but this is largely before the automobile tariffs have kicked in, which they just did a couple of weeks ago. How are you feeling about everything? What's your mood, all your conversations, your LinkedIn private chats? How are people doing?
So this was actually the topic of my newsletter post on Friday because a reporter from a well-known outlet had reached out and she said, Chris, I've been away on leave for a little while, just getting back into things. Just wanted to get your feelings about the EV charging industry and yada, yada.
Hell of a time to get back into things.
Yeah. I said, I don't have a good scoop for you because yes, NEVI is essentially frozen and while they're doing their review. And so, yes, if you're a company or you're a charge point operator that your business future hinged on NEVI grants, you're feeling a lot of pain right now. I don't know the exact number, but the amount of fast charging stations that NEVI funded is actually a relatively small % of the overall number of fast charger stations that get deployed, right? So the Tesla's still deploying stations, EVgo, Iona, Electrify America. Those companies may have had some NEVI grants, but the majority of their sites were non-NEVI. Those companies are still funding and building out their networks. Kevin, you're right that we weren't going after NEVI because it's still a very cumbersome program to navigate and it's a competitive grant.
Yep.
And you don't get reimbursed often until you've built the station. So it's just a lot of moving pieces. So we didn't focus on it. So if you're a company that focused on it, yes, you're impacted. But the industry as a whole, charging stations are still getting built out, NEVI or not. Yes, there's this tax credit both for buying an EV, and then there's also a tax credit for putting in EV charging stations, and both of those could be at risk. But I don't know. Like 3 months ago, I would have put a higher probability that those are at risk than now because there's a lot of political capital that Trump is spending on tariffs. And is he going to have the political capital to go after an extremely popular program? The, Inflation Reduction Act is very popular in a lot of red states that are represented in Congress by Republicans are seeing a lot of jobs for manufacturing facilities that are going in to build batteries and to build EVs and build solar panels. I'm still a little skeptical that all this tariff effort is going to bring over more factories than what the Inflation Reduction Act did. And so, are these Republican lawmakers really going to try to pass a law that is then going to take manufacturing jobs out of their state? Because that's what's going to happen. I mentioned earlier how Hyundai built and is producing EVs right outside Savannah, Georgia. And that district, I believe, is represented by a Republican congressman. Does he want to go to his constituents and say, hey, not only are things going to be made more expensive now because of the efforts that the Trump administration that I supported that they're taking, but we're also going to pass a law that's going to be pulling out manufacturing jobs from this region in the state.
It's a tough sell.
I view that as a very tough, Like, I'm not a marketing or a politician, but I just feel that that's not a great message to get out there. I honestly don't care because I think EVs are still going to like sell. Like maybe they're not going to sell as much or as a higher percent that they would have with the credit. But my overarching principle and driver of like why I'm in this industry is I just think EVs are just better vehicles, hard stop. Now, I've challenged people to debate this topic with me and I'm still accepting challengers. At the end of the day, with or without a tax credit, like that thesis still holds. It's just a better driving experience for the majority of drivers, whether in Europe or you're in America. Is the secret's out, and EVs are just better for the majority of people. And so even if the Trump administration tries to kill the tax credit, I don't know if it's going to have that big of an impact. Yeah, it might slow things, but it's not going to stop them.
You also can see a number of states stepping into the void as well to fill that gap. Colorado, California has already pledged to do that as well.
One comment there, Kevin, just on plug-in and where we're focused. So we want to operate stations.
Mm-hmm.
We want to do both level 2 and DC fast charge because we really want to provide charging where the EV drivers are at. So if they're at a multifamily property or a hotel or an office park, we want to provide charging. If they're on a road trip or if the owner of their apartment complex is cheap and doesn't want to put in EV charging stations, great. We'll provide the fast charger down the street at the grocery store or the Wendy's or wherever. But we want to do that in tight geographies. So we want to do that typically around urban centers where you can put in a high density of chargers under our own brand that we operate and provide the brand awareness and experience so EV drivers are passionate about what we're doing. And then over time, we'll kind of grow and expand out.
Yeah.
That's my little commercial kind of pulling everything together.
What states are you focusing on?
So right now we have sites in Colorado because that's where the first incentives were. And then Colorado, turns out, I think they even have a higher percentage of EV drivers than California or something came out, but they're right up there.
Yeah.
Boston, Sona Energy is based up in Boston. The two founders live there. That's where they started. But the Northeast is also a great market. So really from DC up to Boston, that eastern seaboard of the United States where you have huge population density, huge urban centers is where we're focused on. And then I'm based in Atlanta, but Atlanta is also a really good market for EV. And then it's kind of the gateway to the Southeast. Over time, I want to make it to California. I want to do work in California, but there's also a lot of competitors. But then there's areas like Houston, Austin, Dallas, so the Texas Triangle, Chicagoland, and then, Florida, but you kind of have your own challenges in Florida with the utilities. And that's the other thing in America, you have a lot of utilities and different utility structures. And sometimes they actually compete against you as a CPO. Sometimes they help you. Sometimes they do both. So that's the other thing challenging in this geography is just interfacing with the different utilities.
Chris, you were talking a little bit then about plug-in and your approach to being able to get charge points in the right place and then choose places where you have the right density of EV drivers, but maybe a bit of a deficit in charge points. So you can perhaps try to model out or guarantee a higher utilization level for your company. And then maybe coupling with the fact that there is a shift in the US, definitely with the new administration that is, if any, it's not doing the good things for EV adoption, even if we all believe, and I do agree that, electrification is the way for the future. And so as a result, being able to model that out and understand what impact that will have, whether it's immediate or lagging on your utilization, the amount of drivers, obviously there's going to be less energy that's consumed and that directly translates to profitability. How do you think about solving that problem?
So yes, it's a great question. And previous to our first station coming online in December of 23 at the Wendy's, I spent the bulk of my time on the utilization question and trying to estimate the utilization so we can put it in our pro forma and come up with like a 10-year cash flow model. But at the end of the day, in our business, the only thing that matters is actual data, so empirical data. And so we kind of take data from research and we put it in the model, and then we reinforce the model with the empirical data. And that's really all that matters. I think, let's just say I'm skeptical of any data that's not mine or that I don't know what the root source. I mean, when I was in Miami, I spoke at length with Casper about this. And Monta has some great utilization data because Monta has all the charge points. What I can tell you is from every data provider, the utilization that they said we would see is higher than what the utilization actually is. So is that because our stations are maybe not in the right location, or is there higher competition that came online after we ran those models? I don't know, but I know that the only thing I can trust is what we create from a data perspective.
Interesting.
And so I would just reinforce that message. If you're a beginning CPO, just be cautious, I guess, of the data sources you're getting and just know that the utilization that was predicted may not be what you actually see. It's a more challenging problem than I think anyone, unless you're a ChargePoint operator who's spent years thinking about this, it's just more challenging than I think a lot of people give credit for is that utilization problem. Because look, if utilization skyrockets and these stations are spinning off profit, I mean, it's still hard to deploy efficiently, but it makes my job a lot easier. It's not like that in the majority of cases we've seen. But as a friend who was in a private equity-backed car wash business recently said, he goes, we didn't need to do a lot of research because we knew if a Chick-fil-A was going in on the corner, Chick-fil-A did all their research and we knew going across the street for them was a good business model. So there's some of that too, of like, you know where the good areas in a city are, you know where they're building luxury apartment complexes. Those are probably good areas to put in EV chargers, both level 2 and fast chargers. What we want to do is find property owners who have a lot of property, either in a tight region or in regions that we're attracted by, and say, hey, let's just cherry pick the best sites every year. And we can't control where their properties are, right? But if they have good properties in the regions we're at, that's where we want to deploy. So we drive our business more off relationships with the end user and where they have locations. It's helpful, but I think it's more of we use it as a data point, not the data point. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. All right.
We agree. All right, Chris, we finish with one question for all of our guests. So if you could bust one myth about EVs or the EV charging industry, what would it be? You've done a few of them so far throughout this episode, I think, but looking forward to hearing what you have for us now.
So I already touched on this one a little bit, but I think, especially in America, but I think the myth that ICE vehicles are still the better option for the majority of Americans compared to EVs. Before the election in November, there was this misconception that there was an EV mandate, that Joe Biden had this EV mandate and was going to force people to buy EVs. And it was just BS, but it was one political party trying to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt to get elected. And it worked. It worked on a lot of different fronts. But I think it's just this misconception that EVs are still not ready for the prime time. And yes, it is challenging. And people might say, well, Chris, you just said how challenging it was to drive between, Atlanta and Savannah. I said, well, it's not challenging in a Tesla anymore. So if you want to, go buy a Tesla. They're great, despite we get back into politics when I start talking about Tesla and the Trump administration with Elon Musk and whatever. So things are improving. And for the majority of Americans, EVs, especially if you have 2 cars in your household, EVs are superior for the majority of daily driving habits.
Yeah.
So that's probably it. I think there's still this perception that they're not ready, but they are, and they're great vehicles, and they're faster, quieter, better technology. Again, and that's why, despite all the headwinds and the frustrations that come with trying to create a profitable business in EV charging in the 2020s, I keep coming back to EVs are just better vehicles.
Yeah.
And so the more people who realize that, and over time they do, because when your neighbor gets an EV, you talk to them and they become a more trusted resource than maybe whatever the media or podcast or whatever is going to say. And so over time, that's just going to continue.
We agree wholeheartedly. I think the technology is going to win out, but some more people need to hear that
it's getting better
from their neighbor.
It's getting better and getting more affordable for the most part, right? Yeah. If everything keeps going in that direction.
To close out, I'm leaving another couple hours to bring our first Monta site online. So we're excited. It's a condo building here in Atlanta. So yeah, we're excited to get going full steam ahead with Monta. And then I'm going out to Colorado to one of our charging stations and converting that fast charger to Monta. So we'll have a standard kind of dual port level 2. We'll have single port, more residential style level 2, and then we'll have a fast charge all on Monta by this time in about 2.5 weeks. So
fantastic. That's what we love to hear.
Be getting off the ground.
Awesome. We'll look forward to seeing them connected to the platform and everything, and hopefully see that utilization tick up. So really, really happy that you've joined the team.
Well, and not to keep talking too much, but the one I'm changing is not viewable, or the plug status is not viewable on PlugShare because the software provider hasn't integrated OCPI for some decent reasons, but it just goes to show there's a lot of different things to do to try to drive utilization and reliability, and we felt that Monta gives us that. So again, we're excited to get going here.
Cool. Sounds great. Chris, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you guys for the invite.